Welcome back to Crime Time, Inc. Today, we're going to explore one of Australia's most puzzling criminal cases, the Snowtown Murders, or as some people call it, the Bodies in the Barrels murders.
Yeah.
This case, it spanned a number of years, involved many victims, and it really shocked the nation with its brutality and complexity. What makes this case so intriguing is the intricate web of relationships between the perpetrators and the victims. The way the crimes were carried out and the motivations behind them are really what draw people in.
I think that's true. It's a case that really gets you thinking about the darkest sides of human behavior. And the fact that it happened in seemingly ordinary towns and suburbs makes it even more unsettling.
Right. Okay, so let's start with John Bunting,
Okay.
the man at the center of it all. On the surface, he seemed ordinary, but underneath it all, there was a very, very dark side.
There was. Bunting had this fascination with death that started very early in his life. Even as a child, he would kill insects, dissect animals, and this fascination eventually grew into an obsession with people he considered deviants, pedophiles and homosexuals.
And he created what he called a rock spider wall in his house.
He did.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so it was literally a wall where he would write names and connections of people he suspected. So it was like this physical manifestation of his paranoia and his hatred. It gives us some insight into his disturbing worldview. And it was from this point that he started to pull others into his world.
Yeah, it's just incredible how he was able to manipulate these people who were so vulnerable. He brought them into his twisted way of thinking. He used a certain type of charisma, I guess, to build this group of accomplices.
Exactly. You had Robert Wagner, Mark Hayden, and James Vlasakis.
Right.
They became central figures in Bunting's group, and they all had their own vulnerabilities that Bunting was able to exploit. For example, Wagner was illiterate and had a very difficult past, which made him particularly susceptible to Bunting's influence.
Wow. The relationships between the perpetrators and the victims in this case are so complex. Some of them were friends, family members, even lovers. It's really difficult to comprehend the level of betrayal these victims must have felt.
Yeah, it's one of the most unsettling things about this case. And the victims, there were 12 confirmed victims in all, weren't all pedophiles or homosexuals like Bunting claimed to target.
Right.
Some of them were chosen simply because they were easy targets.
So let's talk about some of these specific murders to really understand the level of brutality that was involved here. The first victim, Clinton Tracise, was a young man who Bunting accused of being a pedophile. Even though there was no evidence to support this,
Right.
what happened to him?
Well, in 1992, Tracise was beaten to death in Bunting's living room. It was a really brutal act of violence, and his remains were not found for 2 years. Then you have Michael Gardner,
Right.
a transgender woman who was targeted because of Bunting's prejudice.
Right. Gardner was strangled and then dismembered. And to cover up their crime, Bunting and Wagner staged a robbery at Gardner's house. And then the details of Fred Brooks's murder are particularly disturbing.
Yes, they are.
Brooks was just 18 years old,
Yeah.
and he was the nephew of Mark Hayden's wife. And Bunting suspected, with absolutely no proof, that Brooks was abusing young girls. Brooks was tortured for hours, burned with cigarettes, a sparkler. They even used a variac machine, which is a tool used in electroplating, to inflict pain on him.
It's awful.
It's awful. They forced Brooks to reveal his banking information, and then they recorded his voice to create these messages to mislead people.
Yeah.
And they did this with a lot of the victims.
Yeah.
They would use their account to impersonate them even after they were dead. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah, it was a recurring pattern, and it added a really calculated layer of cruelty to the crimes. It wasn't just about killing, it was about profiting from it as well.
Right. So now let's talk about how these crimes were carried out. The victims were lured to different locations, often under false pretenses. One example is David Johnson, who was James Vlasakis' own stepbrother.
Yes.
What happened there?
Well, Vlasakis, under pressure from Bunting, tricked Johnson into going to the Snowtown bank
Okay.
with the promise of a cheap computer.
Wow.
When Johnson stepped into the building, he was immediately overpowered. It was a very carefully planned betrayal, and it happened within a family that was already broken by this group's actions.
So the victims were subdued, tortured, and killed, often over a period of days. And the methods that they used to dispose of the bodies are just almost beyond comprehension.
They are. They tried to use acid baths to dissolve the bodies, but that was mostly ineffective. In the end, they resorted to storing the remains in barrels, which is how the case got that name. The bodies in the barrels.
And they forced the victims to record messages before they killed them. The voices of the dead we've heard about. to mislead families and authorities.
Yeah, and those recordings really show the calculated and manipulative nature of these crimes. The level of planning that went into it is astounding.
It is.
It adds this whole other layer of psychological torment on top of an already horrific situation.
So how did this house of horrors finally come crashing down? There were a number of missing persons cases over the years, right?
Yeah, there were. And at first, the police treated them as isolated incidents. It wasn't until they started to see connections between the missing people that they began to suspect something more sinister was going on. But the real breakthrough came with the discovery of those barrels in the Snowtown bank.
That must have been an incredibly grim discovery.
It was. The police officers were hit with this overpowering stench of decay. And inside those barrels, they found a gruesome puzzle of human remains. 8 victims were found inside, each one in a different stage of decomposition.
It's hard to even imagine the horror of that scene. This discovery led to the arrests of Bunting, Wagner, and Hayden. But there's another key player here, James Vlassakis.
Right. Vlassakis became the main source of information for the case. He was only 19 years old at the time, and he was very traumatized by what he had seen and what he had taken part in. His confession, which lasted 19 days, provided a lot of crucial details that helped the police understand the whole story.
Wow. What does that 19-day confession tell us about the scale of these crimes?
It gives us this horrific picture of psychological manipulation.
Right.
The increasing violence, the cold-blooded planning involved in these murders. Vlassakis' testimony was key in getting convictions against the other perpetrators.
It's hard to believe something like this could occur in what seemed like an ordinary town.
It really is. It reminds us that evil can exist anywhere, even in places that seem normal. It highlights the really devastating consequences of unchecked hatred and prejudice.
So the trials of these men, they were quite a spectacle for the media.
Yeah, they were.
It wasn't easy to actually convict them, was it? Because the evidence was so complex and, these perpetrators, they really tried to cover their tracks.
They did, yeah. The trials were very long and really demanding, filled with a lot of graphic details and chilling testimonies.
And in the end, what were the sentences that they received?
Well, Bunting and Wagner,
Right.
they were identified as the masterminds.
Yeah.
And they received the harshest punishment.
Yeah.
Life in prison without parole. Vlassakis, he was seen more as a pawn in Bunting's game.
Right.
So he was sentenced to life in prison, but with the possibility of parole after 26 years. Hayden, on the other hand, he played a smaller role, so he received a 25-year sentence.
Okay. This case has undeniably left a scar on Australia.
It has.
In Snowtown.
Yeah.
It's a small, quiet town, and now it's forever linked to these really gruesome murders.
Yeah, it's a tragedy for the community, really. The stigma attached to the town is inescapable, even though none of the murders actually happened there.
Right.
Except for David Johnson's.
Right. It's just the fact that this case still has this hold on people.
Yeah.
It speaks volumes about, the darkness that can exist in seemingly normal people.
It does, yeah.
It's disturbing, but it's also intriguing.
It is.
It makes you think about the nature of evil.
Right.
The power of manipulation and the importance of justice,
It's interesting how it still captures people's imaginations. It forces us to face this really uncomfortable truth. Evil doesn't always look monstrous.
Right.
It can be hidden behind what seems normal, which makes it even more dangerous.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, let's dive a bit deeper into the actual investigation. How did the police finally connect the dots and realize that they were dealing with a serial killer?
Well, there were quite a few missed opportunities early on.
Yeah.
Like, for instance, Clinton Tresise's disappearance back in 1992.
Right.
It wasn't really investigated properly.
Right. His remains were found in 94, but they weren't identified until much later.
Exactly.
Right.
If they had been identified earlier, who knows? Maybe some of the later murders could have been prevented.
That's a terrifying thought.
Right.
So what was the moment, the one that really changed the direction of the investigation?
A routine missing person inquiry in 1999.
Okay.
They started looking into the disappearance of Elizabeth Hayden,
Right.
Mark Hayden's wife, and her disappearance raised a lot of red flags for the police. The officers started to suspect a connection between Elizabeth Hayden and some other missing persons. People like Suzanne Allen, Ray Davies, and Gavin Porter,
Right.
all of whom had links to John Bunting and Robert Wagner.
Ah, so it's like this web of connections all pointing back to Bunting.
Exactly. And as the police dug deeper, they found these financial irregularities. Bunting and Wagner were accessing the bank accounts of these missing people.
Wow. It's amazing they managed to fool so many people for so long.
They were very cunning and manipulative, yeah. They made up all these elaborate stories to explain the disappearances,
Yeah.
saying that the victims had just moved away.
And they used those recordings, the
Yeah.
voices of the dead,
Right.
to make it seem like the victims were still alive.
Exactly. It's really chilling how far their deception went. But the police didn't give up. They started keeping a close eye on Bunting, Wagner, and Hayden.
So that eventually led them to Snowtown.
It did, yeah. They followed the three of them to this small town called Snowtown. It's about 150 kilometers north of Adelaide.
Okay.
They saw them going into this abandoned bank.
So at that point, the police didn't know about the barrels.
No, not yet. They were still focused on the disappearances, and Snowtown was just another lead they were following.
Right.
It was a huge turning point, though. They got a search warrant for the bank, and on May 20th, 1999, they made that horrible discovery that would link Snowtown to one of Australia's most infamous crimes.
Wow, it's hard to imagine what those officers must have felt when they opened those barrels. Just the pure horror of that moment.
Yeah, it must have been like something out of a nightmare. The smell of decay and what they found inside, it was like something from a horror film.
Body parts, acid, just the remnants of unimaginable suffering.
That bank vault became a symbol of the worst of humanity.
So the discovery of those barrels, it just sent shockwaves through Australia.
It did.
It was all over the news for weeks.
Yeah, the whole nation was captivated and horrified at the same time. The case became known as the Bodies in the Barrels Murders. And Snowtown, this peaceful town, was suddenly in the spotlight of the world's media.
I can't imagine what that media frenzy must have been like, especially for the people living in Snowtown.
Yeah, it was a really traumatic experience for the community. Reporters from everywhere descended on the town, wanting to get the inside scoop on this gruesome discovery.
And while the media attention did bring the horrors of these crimes to light, it also probably sensationalized the case.
It did. And often the stories of the victims got lost in all the spectacle.
Yeah, that's a risk with these high-profile cases, isn't it?
It is. The focus shifts to the perpetrators and the sensational details, and the victims and their families are kind of forgotten.
And it's so important to remember that behind the headlines, there were real people whose lives were taken away from them.
Absolutely. We have to remember them and acknowledge the huge impact these crimes had on their loved ones.
You know, these families, they not only had to deal with the loss of their loved ones, but also with the horrifying way they died.
Yeah, the psychological toll must have been immense. The Snowtown murders, they were a truly disturbing chapter in Australia's history. The case showed the dark side of society, the weaknesses in the welfare system, and how a charismatic psychopath can manipulate people.
And the effects of these crimes, they're still being felt today.
They are.
It's interesting how this case still makes us talk about the nature of evil, the role of the media in shaping public opinion, and how important it is to protect the vulnerable.
Yeah, it makes us remember that we have to be careful and stand up against hatred and intolerance. We have to work together to create a society where things like this are unthinkable.
Right. I mean, looking at the bigger picture, the Snowtown murders, they force us to confront these uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the society we live in.
They do. They challenge us to look beyond the surface, to see that evil doesn't always announce itself. It can be hidden in plain sight, waiting for the chance to strike. And it makes you think about how we can stop vulnerable people from becoming victims of manipulators like John Bunting.
Yeah, how can we protect them?
Right.
It shows just how important it is to recognize the signs of manipulation and abuse and to actually speak up when we see something wrong.
Absolutely. It's everyone's job to keep our communities safe. The Snowtown murders also revealed the flaws in our social welfare system, the ones that Bunting and his group exploited.
Yeah, they collected their victims' benefits even after they were dead. It's incredible they got away with it for so long.
Yeah, it shows that we need stronger controls and more careful monitoring to stop this kind of horrible exploitation from happening again.
The Snowtown murders, they remind us that evil can appear anywhere, even in the most unexpected places. And we have to be constantly on guard to try and understand and fight against it. The brutality of these crimes, the way they planned it all out, and the complex relationships between everyone involved. It's a case that continues to both fascinate and horrify us.
It does. It's left a permanent mark on Australia, and it still makes us think about the darkest parts of human nature.
As usual, Simon and Tom will discuss this case in their weekly review on Sunday, but in the meantime, tune in tomorrow for another great true crime episode.